Hello, everyone, and welcome into the new season of the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats. It's the start of season number 5. I'm back from the holiday break. If you listen to the end of the last episode from season 4, you know this year's holidays were bittersweet for my family because, of course, my father passed away. I would like to take the time to sincerely thank every one of you listeners that sent me your condolences. There are too many names for me to read through here on the podcast, but I tried to reply to every email, every text, every post that you listeners sent me with my sincere, heartfelt thank you. But now it's time to look forward to 2025. I'm renewed, refreshed from the time off, and I'm ready to charge in to the new year. To start season 5 of the show, I'm jumping back 25,000 years to the earliest novel in the Legends timeline. On ancient Tython, the Order of Jedi ponder the mysteries of the Force. Ashla and Bogan are constantly in conflict, the light and the dark. Only by maintaining a balance can the Jedi help the people of the Tython system. But someone yearns to explore the galaxy outside of the system, and he's willing to destroy Tython to reach the stars. When Jedi Ranger Lannery Brock is ordered to track the man down, she learns that it's her brother, Dalian. Her brother that she thought had died 9 years ago. It's Dawn of the Jedi, Into the Void by Tim Leben. And we'll talk about that book coming up in just a few minutes. But first, it's listener question time. I have 2 messages today. The first comes from Ryland. Ryland says, if you could design your perfect fleet, what ships would you use and who would command them? My fleet would consist of an Eclipse-class Super Star Destroyer as my flagship, commanded by Grand Admiral Thrawn. I would also use 4 Assertor-class Star Dreadnoughts as some heavy damage dealers, 16 Imperial II Star Destroyers, the M-Star Deuce. They are equipped with long-range turbo lasers and small interdiction capabilities. I would then choose to have some Carrack-class cruisers as escorts and Lancer-class frigates to provide protection against enemy starfighters. I would also probably include an Onager-class Star Destroyer, which is basically a sniper rifle in space. As for starfighters, I would choose to mostly have TIE Defenders and Scimitar assault bombers. What would you choose? Well, thank you very much for the question, Ryland. It should come as no surprise that I am not as big of a ship person as it sounds like you are. To me, I just look at the ships and do they look cool? That's it. I've always thought the coolest looking fleet in Star Wars was the Imperial fleet that arrived at Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back. So, give me everything that Vader and Admiral Ozzel and Captain Nita and Captain/Admiral Piet had there. But instead of those people in charge, I'd have Grand Admiral Thrawn in command, along with Admiral Akbar, Admiral Pelion, and Admiral Jan Dodonna, with Commander Wedge Antilles and Baron Suterfell and General Hera Syndulla in charge of starfighter squadrons. Now, when it comes to those fighters, I like my troops to be protected, so give me some ships with shields. I'll take a combination of X-Wings and TIE Defenders with some of the bigger B-Wings to pack a punch. Today's second email comes from Wes. Wes says, you've mentioned before you went to school to be a journalist. If you could sit down and have a 60-minute style interview with a character or characters from the Star Wars universe, who would they be? For me, my gut says Obi-Wan Kenobi, as he's my favorite. However, I think an interview containing Darth Traya, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Vergere would be extremely interesting. You'd certainly have your fill of philosophy and out-of-the-box thinking with that group. Well, thank you very much for the email, Wes. Now, if you were talking a 60-minute style interview, those are hard-hitting. And I can think of two characters that I would want to have a hard-hitting interview with. For me, it would be Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. You guys know I pretty much love everything in Star Wars. I love Obi-Wan Kenobi. I love Yoda. They're not two of my favorite characters, but I love both of them. When I want to do this 60-minute interview, I want to do it after the events of everything that we see. I want to talk to these two as they are Force ghosts. So they're sort of looking back over everything that's happened in the saga. And I really want to grill them. I want to ask about the choices they made with Anakin, what they might have done differently, the failure of the Jedi Order in the last years of the Republic, staying out of the rebellion as long as they did until Luke was ready to start training in the Force, keeping the secret of who Luke and Leia's father was from them. And then I want to ask them what they thought about the choices that Luke and Leia made in the decades after the events of the original trilogy, which then led to the rise of the First Order and the Sith Eternal in the sequel trilogy. And I want to know whether or not Obi-Wan and Yoda offered Luke and Leia any advice during that time. Now, there would be some stipulations. They would have to agree to some certain things before we did this interview. Two things, actually. Number one, no using the Force to try to influence the questions that I offer them. And two, no answering questions from a certain point of view. If we're going to sit down and do this hard-hitting 60-minute style interview, I want them to answer every question I have openly and honestly. Thanks again for the messages, Ryland and Wes. Listener, if you would like to get in touch with the podcast to ask a question or give your opinion, you can send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. And if you'd like to get your voice on the show, just record a short message and email it in. But please record it in MP3 audio format. Now, we'll hear from Wes again later in the show as he sent in the first Star Wars character grouping of season number 5. So stick around for that. But now it's time for today's book, Dawn of the Jedi Into the Void by Tim Leben. Now, one quick thing about this book. The story is told in parallel plot lines about a decade apart. Many of the chapters begin in one time period and then jump to the other time period toward the second half of each chapter. I think that would be pretty confusing and sound really bad on a podcast if I kept jumping back and forth between the two time periods, because I'd have to keep telling everyone, now we're in the past, now we're in the present, and going back and forth that way. So I'm going to start out in the present. I will jump to the past, tell that entire storyline, and then return to the present and finish that entire storyline. Sound good? Great. Listener, grab yourself a drink. Let's head in to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. The story begins 25,000 years ago on ancient Tython, a planet strong in the Force. Tython is the main planet in the system, and it's the seat of the Jedi Order. The Jedi patrol the system, keeping the peace. Lannery Brock is one of the foremost Jedi Rangers. She's the daughter of two powerful masters, but her younger brother Dalian wasn't as strong in the Force as the rest of his family. As he grew up, Dale became resentful of his parents. When it was time for Lannery to begin her Force training, her brother did too, and that ended in tragedy. Lannery thinks about her brother often. In fact, she's thinking about Dalian when she's summoned back to Tython to appear in front of the Jedi Council. The Masters have a new mission for Lannery. A fanatical cult is trying to use dark matter to create a cosmic gateway, which could allow them to travel outside the system and across the galaxy. The Council wants Lannery to find the leader of the cult and stop him. When she asks why the Masters chose her for this assignment, they say that Lannery is uniquely qualified to track the man down, because it's her brother, Dalian. Impossible, Lannery says. Dale died 9 years ago. I saw it. You're wrong, the Masters say. Dalian is alive, and he's going to destroy the system. The words stun Lannery, but she quickly overcomes her shock and heads out to find her brother. Now, jumping back a decade, we see it's time for Lannery and Dalian to begin their Jedi training. Lannery is strong with the Force like her parents, but Dale doesn't have the same talents as the rest of his family. As they grow up, Dale becomes angrier and angrier. He begins to turn away from his family and starts looking toward the stars. Still, when they become old enough, Lannery and Dale set off to train to become Jedi Rangers. As part of their training, the siblings travel across the continent on foot, trekking through dense forests, frozen glaciers, and burning sands. At each stop along the way, there's a Jedi temple, where Lannery and Dale train under different masters. At one temple, they learn how to breathe. At another, they learn how to use the Force to interact with the world around them. At each stop, Lannery and the other students excel, but Dale struggles. He repeatedly tries to perform his tasks without using the Force. It's frustrating to Lannery and the temple masters. They can feel the anger and frustration radiating from Dale. Lannery pleads with her brother to open himself to the Force, but he refuses. Lannery doesn't know how to help her brother, but then he does something surprising. At one of the temples, the master orders the students to attack him with any weapon they can find. Lannery, Dale, and the other students charge, and of course, the master easily sidesteps their attacks. The Jedi tosses the students away left and right. The students attack again, and again, the master knocks them back. But then, when Lannery and the students charge the master for a third time, Dale quickly moves around behind him. He sneaks in close, and as the master parries one of the other students' attacks, Dale strikes and lands a kick on the master. "See," he tells Lannery, "I don't need to use the Force to beat you." Lannery and Dale's training continues over the next year. Lannery becomes more powerful with the Force, while Dale struggles and falls further and further behind. Finally, while Lannery studies at the Temple of Science, Dale travels with a group of students to a place called the Riftlands to gather samples. But Dale skips out on the group and returns to the temple, where he confronts Lannery. When another student intervenes, Dale shoots him and kills him. Dale flees with Lannery in hot pursuit. She tracks her brother to a place called the Old City, a set of ancient ruins and dangerous predators. Frantically, Lannery searches for her brother when she hears a scream. She runs toward the sound. There's no body, but Lannery finds Dale's clothes, shredded and bloodied. She returns to the temple in mourning, believing Dale is dead. Now in the present, Lannery is tasked with chasing down a ghost because her brother is alive and leading the Stargazers, a group who want to open a hypergate in the old city to allow them access to the rest of the galaxy. But the dark matter needed to fuel the hypergate could destroy the planet and the entire system. Now the Jedi Council tells Lannery to start her search on the planet Kalimar. There, she meets with a Twi'lek informant named Trey. Trey takes Lannery to meet with Kara, a wealthy woman who is rumored to be funding the Stargazers. Kara seems polite, but Lannery and Trey believe the woman is hiding something. When it seems like the conversation is over, Trey stuns Kara, allowing Lannery the time to search the woman's office. Lannery finds a clue which leads her and Trey to travel to a temple on the other side of the planet. They find the temple abandoned, but Lannery discovers evidence that her brother is indeed alive. He was here, but now he's on the move, and he's headed to another planet in the system, Nox. On Nox, Lannery and Trey track the Stargazers to a military research facility where Dale has just completed building the device that will open the hypergate. Lannery tries to find a way to sneak into the facility, but it turns out Dale has been expecting her, and Lannery and Trey are captured. The Stargazers want to kill the prisoners, but Dale just can't kill his sister. He and the Stargazers head out to find the fuel for Dale's device, leaving Lannery and Trey under guard. But you can't keep a Jedi Ranger in prison. Lannery and Trey break out and learn that Dale is headed to another planet called Sunspot to get the dark matter he needs to fuel the hypergate device. On Sunspot, Lannery follows the Stargazers down into one of the planet's mines. She arrives just as Dale inserts a cube of Marionium into his device. When combined with the other elements that Dale has gathered, the Marionium creates a spark of dark matter. Something so powerful and dangerous it could annihilate everything in the Tython system. Lannery tries to stop her brother, but Dale shoots her in the chest and flees, heading back to Tython to open the hypergate. He leaves Lannery to die, but Trey arrives and rescues her, treating Lannery's wounds on her ship as the two pursue Dale to Tython. Lannery and Trey follow the Stargazers to the Old City. They fight through the cult members, killing several of them. Trey is wounded along the way, forcing Lannery to leave him behind as she searches for her brother. Lannery finds Dale and confronts him just as he starts his device. Lannery orders her brother to turn it off, but Dale refuses. He calls his sister a slave to the Force and pleads with her to join him, to open a gateway to the rest of the galaxy. Lannery refuses and tries to stop her brother, but Dale attacks again, swinging a knife at his sister. Lannery blocks the attack and forces her brother back. Dale turns away and lunges for the device to try and open the hypergate. Leaving her with no other choice, Lannery swings her Jedi sword and kills her brother. She destroys the hypergate device and takes Trey to get his wounds treated. The story ends with Lannery returning to Kalimar to arrest Kara. Instead, she finds that Kara has disappeared. Was Dalian really the leader of the Stargazers, Lannery thinks? Or was her brother being used by Kara and her wealthy comrades? Time to take a break. When I return, I'll talk more about Dawn of the Jedi Into the Void. What worked for me? What didn't? All that and more after the break. I'm Aaron Moats. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Thank you for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, where we celebrate the books from Star Wars Legends. But let me take a moment and recommend a book from Star Wars canon. Thrawn is a story full of smugglers, pirates, and political infighting. See how the brilliant Chiss tactician climbed his way up the ranks of the Imperial Navy, with a little help from his reluctant aide, Eli Vanto. Check out Thrawn by Timothy Zahn. Welcome back to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats, and today I'm talking about Dawn of the Jedi, Into the Void by Tim Levin. This was the second time that I've read Dawn of the Jedi, Into the Void. The first time I read it was years ago, shortly after the mass market paperback edition was published. I enjoy the story. It's got some interesting things to say about the ancient Jedi Rangers. I like how they spell that. It's Jei''Dai'. You can really see where the etymology of the word Jedi comes from within the Star Wars universe. I enjoy the character of Lannery Brock. I like the story of her having to hunt down her brother and stop him from possibly destroying the planet. However, this is one of those instances where, as someone who isn't much of a comic reader, the story of the ancient Jedi and the planet Tython and Lannery Brock and Dalian and many of the other Jedi masters that we are introduced to in this story have the majority continue in the Dawn of the Jedi comic series. I've never read any of those. In the middle of my mass market paperback edition, there is a small excerpt from one of the comics. It doesn't have any of the characters from this story, so as an excerpt, I was a little lost when I was reading it. I think this book works best if you consider it like a small episode arc of a television show, where the comic run, and this book included, is the entire show, with an ensemble cast of characters who are setting forth the early tenets of what we understand to become the Jedi Order. There's talk in this book about balance of the Force. It's not exactly what I would consider how George Lucas talks about balance in the Force. Here in this story, the ancient Jedi literally talk about how you, the individual, have to balance between the light and the dark, the Ashla and Bogan of the Force. Meaning, at least as far as this story goes, you can't have an excess of one over the other and remain true to who you are as a member of the Jedi Order. I wouldn't say that's how Lucas defines balance within the Force when it comes to the individual, but that is how these ancient Jedi talk about balance in the Force. Of course, for those of you who know a lot of the lore of Star Wars, you recognize the terms Ashla and Bogan from how Lucas originally thought of the names light side and dark side when he was fleshing out his notes in the early 1970s for what would become the Star Wars saga. And Ashla and Bogan have been used elsewhere throughout the Star Wars saga. They've been repurposed from Lucas's original notes, most notably in some of the stories surrounding Ahsoka Tano, where she has assumed the alias of Ashla. And then, of course, in the Ahsoka television show, where Baylan Skoll mentions that Ezra Bridger was raised as a Bogan Jedi out in the wild. So, not exactly the same as the light side, dark side characteristics that Lucas had in his original notes, but the terms have been repurposed and reused in Star Wars again throughout the years. My favorite aspect of this book is the conflict between Lannery and Dalian, aka Dale, where Lannery is constantly trying to encourage Dale to accept the Force, to open himself to the Force, in order to try to become a better person. On the flip side, I like some of the arguments Dale makes to Lannery that not everything is about the Force. At one point, he calls Lannery and his parents a slave to the Force. It's hard to understand what he means without reading the passage in the book. So, for context, what I got out of it was Dale is suspicious that Lannery, his parents, and the Jedi as a whole rely too much on asking the Force for guidance in the decisions that they make, in the actions that they take. Whereas Dale, who is not as naturally gifted in the Force as his family members, grows up learning to do things on his own, learning to do things without the help of the Force. And he tries to tell that to Lannery and to his parents as he's growing up. And I think he gets frustrated when the other members of his family constantly tell him that the way he is doing things is not correct, that you should be using the Force in everything you do, or at least meditating and thinking upon the Force before you make a decision. And Dale's point of view is sometimes you can simply make a decision based upon your feelings, your experiences, and your knowledge of what is right and wrong. I think it's this frustration as the story goes along in the timeline we see in the past that opens Dale up to making poor choices. You know, we talk about how in Star Wars there is good and evil. And more than many other stories, good and evil in Star Wars is mostly black and white. There isn't as much gray in Star Wars. Sometimes I think that's what the saga does best, and other times I do think the fact that there is so much black and white, good and evil in the saga, it may hold itself back a little bit. It may handcuff itself in its storytelling. But I think in Star Wars, for the most part, that gray area is more people's motivations. Not what is good and evil, but what drives a person. I think you have that in this story. In much the same way that in the prequel era, in the prequel trilogy, what causes Anakin to fall to the dark side is the desire, is the motivation to do something good, to protect Padme, to protect the people that he loves. That desire for love and affection warps Anakin's decision making. And I think that's the same thing that happens in this story. Dale's desire, his motivations, are to show his family members that he is not somehow less than them, that he is just as worthy of a human being as they are, that he can accomplish the same things that they can, that he can live a full, meaningful life without using the Force. But his family members keep looking down upon him for simply not being as strong in the Force as they are. And I think it's the frustration, the anger that Dale feels that compounds over time for just his desire to be fully accepted by his family that leads him to making bad decisions. Again, good and evil in the Star Wars saga is pretty black and white. The decisions you make are either good decisions or they are bad decisions. And I think if you look back through the saga, most of that is undebatable. But the gray area that Star Wars works in is what motivates this character to make their decisions. For me, that conflict within Dale himself and between Dale and Lannery is the most interesting part of this book. Besides that, it's a fairly standard Star Wars adventure where they move from place to place in pursuit of something. But it's a good read. This book is a good read. However, I think if you're like me and really all you do is read the books, you may not get as much satisfaction as you would as if you also read all of the Dawn of the Jedi comics to fully flesh out this part of the story. Before I get to the end of the show, I did want to mention that for those of you who like to read up on a bunch of Star Wars news and rumors, there was a story going around online earlier this week where James Mangold had spoken to someone from MovieWeb, the website, about his upcoming Star Wars movie. Of course, James Mangold is supposedly attached to be the director of a Dawn of the Force, Dawn of the Jedi type movie. And according to MovieWeb, Mangold said, quote, "The Star Wars movie would take place 25,000 years before any known Star Wars movie. It's in an area and a playground that I've always wanted to explore, that I was inspired by as a teenager, and that I do not want to be handcuffed by so much of the lore in Star Wars that at this point it's almost unmovable and you can't please the audience." So just something to think about for a possible Dawn of the Jedi, Dawn of the Force movie that was announced at the 2023 Star Wars Celebration to be in development at Lucasfilm. Fingers crossed, we get that movie. It sounds like something that I would be interested in. Well, it's almost time to go, but before I do, I have another Star Wars character grouping to share with everyone. Wes wants his group to research and write a compendium detailing the history of the saga in the galaxy far, far away. That's a really cool idea. Now, Wes has divided this history across 3 subjects. Jedi history. Wes has Master Dorak from Knights of the Old Republic, Master Yoda, and Grand Master Luke Skywalker writing that part. Writing Sith history. Darth Revan, Darth Traya, and Darth Sidious. And finally, galactic history. Wes has the father from the Mortis gods, Captain Rex, and Leia. Great list, Wes. I'm looking forward to reading that compendium just as soon as you can get it published. Now, listener, if you have a character group that you'd like to share with me, or if you have a question or comment for the show, you can send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky at swlegendslounge. And also, if you received a really cool Star Wars gift over the holidays, let me know. Send me some pictures. I want to see your swag. Now, coming up on the next episode, I'm going to read the last of the Old Republic novels, Knight Errant by John Jackson Miller. Tune in for that episode coming up on January 24th. And if you want to see the full schedule for the season, just check out my pinned posts on Blue Sky and Twitter, where you can see every book I'm going to read in Season 5. Once again, thank you so much for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. I'm Aaron Moats. May the Force be with you. And remember, there's always a bit of truth in Legends.